In 1873, the Coinage Act demonetized silver as legal currency, resulting in the gold standard back in the country. What they really did though was decrease the volume of currency while the debt remained the same. This contributed to widespread panic and depression that arose that same year, all while the rich bankers continued absorbing assets. Again, in 1893, over-speculation, failing banks, continuous government spending, and a strict gold standard for over 20 years resulted in the US having to be bailed out by the private sector. In other words, the US government had to kneel down to Papa JP Morgan, showing us that private capital was now more powerful than public institutions. 14 years later, in 1907, the Heinz family controlled a national bank in New York and tried to buy out all public shares of United Copper, but were unable to afford it, so the stock price plummeted. This exposed to the people that bankers were playing with their savings, and bank runs from lack of confidence choked the economy as banks quit lending money. The core problem was that our government didn't have a central bank issuing its own currency. But once again, America's greatest patriot stepped in. JP Morgan came in and personally chose which institutions would receive bailouts and which would be left to fend for themselves. This constant instability every few decades was due to what Milford Howard refers to as the plutocrats. They carelessly, or likely with calculated reasoning, manipulate the economy and the lives of millions across the nation. This instability in the market gave the plutocrats a perfect story to establish a central bank in America. And while this was necessary to maintain consistency across the nation, what wasn't necessary was the fact that all money printed past 1913 has been directed by the Federal Reserve, a privately controlled banking system that was organized in 1910, 3 years prior, on Jekyll Island, with the most powerful men in the world at that time, a meeting that allegedly contained around a quarter of the world's wealth in a single room. Here, they created a blueprint for America and arguably the world. Milford Howard was an American politician and writer who wrote The American Plutocracy, a book that was a wake-up call to Americans. Howard describes the plutocrats as the wealthy elite. One of their favorite things to do is what I just described. They influence, or in some cases create, problems among society to support a public narrative. Then they show us the solution. But in reality, we end up sacrificing liberty for security. And in Howard's own words, from 1895, now plutocracy reigns supreme. It now forces all the world to come and worship at its shrine. By far the most prevalent example, what was once pushed as coming from a wet market, but more than likely came from a lab, by mistake or on purpose, who knows. What we do know is that the government didn't waste a second to bend the knee to the private sector once again. In 2020, Operation Warp Speed paid out billions to large pharmaceutical corporations with liability protections according to the PrEP Act. Along with that, immediate censorship followed on most, if not all, platforms to suit a narrative. Under the guise of safety, strict mandates were established controlling people, all while the plutocratic class lived lavishly. Quickly, the nation was shut down, and every ounce of this crisis was milked to pass any bill deemed necessary. While the situation could have been far worse, it reminds me of the following testimony in Howard's book by a multi-millionaire. Sean C. Depew says, 50 men in these United States have it in their power by reason of the wealth which they control to come together within 24 hours and arrive at an understanding by which every wheel of trade and commerce may be stopped from revolving, every avenue of trade blocked, and every electric key struck down. Those 50 men can paralyze the whole country, for they can control the circulation of the currency and create panic whenever they will. Another classic example where the rich show us there are no consequences for what they do. The housing crash of 2008 led many major companies to or near bankruptcy. And what did the government do in response? They passed a Troubled Asset Relief Program and gave around $30 billion to homeowners, which sounds great until you realize the entire fund was $700 billion, most of which ended up in the hands of big corporations, mainly big banks. The very institutions responsible for bringing the nation to a halt were the ones favored above the people when the economy crashed. The Treasury Secretary at the time was literally an ex-executive at Goldman Sachs. Another fun fact, not a single person was prosecuted for having anything to do with the 2008 crash. The plutocrats have courts, churches, the military, and many high officials ready to keep them where they are. They hardly try to fool us into believing a lie anymore, because it seems no matter the narrative they share, nothing ever gets done about it. Humanity has never been at peace, but it was the great fear caused by terror attacks that provided the perfect motivation to enter war, base money, and increase surveillance. Not 2 months after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed, allowing the US to spy on anyone, including citizens, without any warrants. Soon after, war with various Middle Eastern countries began, and oil giants were quick to establish pipelines and seize control of as much oil reserves as possible. These weren't the first wars in the Middle East, but a major expansion to an ongoing game. At the same time, many of these Middle Eastern nations lacked a plutocratic-controlled central bank. You see, these people don't see wars as mass casualties, but as chessboard moves to better their position in the world. Howard wisely says, the greed for gain gets such possession of men's souls that they become demons. The level of wealth that some families have attained makes them lose track of their humanity, but plutocratic behavior is found everywhere. In general, the entire system has corrupted because of how large it has become. You don't even need to be a big banker to fulfill plutocratic desires at this point. People in major cities around the US are paid to solve problems like homelessness, but once they get into power, they forget their job is to serve the people. We can look at how politicians who are elected into office consistently have insider information and somehow outperform everyone on the stock market, or we can consider how foreign lobbyist groups heavily influence our leaders, from more local officials to the President of the United States. Corruption seems to be present everywhere. As Howard put it, he is only wanted so long as his services are useful and his vote is needed, and then he is turned out to tramp and starve. The illusion of democracy is maintained by elections. Power is defended with wealth. Every election always seems closer to choosing between the lesser of two evils instead of between the better of two greats. The vote is not only used to pin us against one another, but seems to lose its value as the country moves closer and closer to a nation of princes and paupers. At the end of the day, this pattern is difficult to ignore. Plutocrats use chaos to squeeze the middle class as they cash out billions. Milford Howard holds some optimism that we might be able to change this with the current system in place, but maybe not. While the nation hasn't collapsed since Howard's year of 1895, it is clear the plutocratic class maintains control of the world, and it seems as though only revolution could change something that is this embedded. The government should print its own debt-free currency, foreign influence in politics should be prevented, and accounting as a whole needs to improve, or the nation's descent into dystopia ever increases. Revolution is drastic, but as Victor Hugo said, the paradise of the rich is made out of the house of the poor. The revolution is a work of the unknown. Call it good or bad, as you yearn towards the future or the past.